10 minutes to 1 in the afternoon of November the 28th, 1979, Air New Zealand Flight 901 crashed into a mountain in Antarctica. There were no survivors. It was the fourth worst accident in aviation history. Despite a series of disastrous administrative blunders, Air New Zealand insisted the crash was due to pilot error. This is the story of the disaster and the subsequent inquiry.
If I had seen Captain Collins that morning, I probably would have just said to him, even in passing, well, Jim, there's been a couple of miles change. It won't make any difference to the flight plan. Nobody knew that there was a 27-mile change.
In 14 flights to Antarctica, Air New Zealand had offered passengers from around the world a chance to see the last great frontier.
Absolutely fabulous, and I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Is it how you expected?
It's beyond anything I've ever dreamt of.
It was a dream experience from the cocktail party comfort of an aircraft dedicated to passenger pleasure. The experience was as intoxicating as the champagne. For the passengers, cocooned in the warmth and comfort of their cabin, 7 million square miles of frozen grandeur below them, it would be difficult to imagine a more ideal way of seeing Antarctica.
Does that strike you as a remarkable sequence of errors made by perhaps 5 different persons in respect to the same subject matter?
Yes, sir, it's very describing.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Is it better than you expected?
I don't know what I expected. It's just beautiful.
The flights provided a view from a few thousand feet, matching the airline's advertising slogan, "Nobody does it better." There may have been rumblings about the advisability of such flights, especially from the Americans. But for the day trippers, it was the experience of a lifetime.
It was a bit like going to a cocktail party that ran all day.
It was just fantastic, it really was.
Would you go again?
Next week, if I could.
A week later, there were no spare seats on Flight 901. As well as New Zealanders, there were passengers from America, Japan, Britain, Canada, France, Switzerland, and Australia. Their DC-10 carried a sophisticated navigation computer. What none of them could know that day was that their plane and its pilot had in their own ways been programmed to fly to different destinations.
Operators at 8:17 a.m. on Wednesday the 28th November 1979, a DC-10 aircraft operated by Air New Zealand Limited was cleared for takeoff Mangere Airport. It was bound on a sightseeing visit to Antarctica via Auckland Island, the Balleny Islands, Cape Hallett and McMurdo Station, intending to return by way of Cape Hallett, Campbell Island and Christchurch.
I can see there's still grounds of hope if they came down somewhere, well, even on the sea. We're doing our best. There's a Hercules, there are helicopters, another Starlifter. But the fact that worries me is that about an hour ago, on calculations, the fuel would have run out.
The American searchers initially concentrated their efforts close to their McMurdo base. They had little reason to look elsewhere. For one thing, believing that 901 was flying straight along the flat sea ice of McMurdo Sound, the American air controller had invited the DC-10 down to 1,500 feet, close to the established military route. And back in New Zealand, the pilot of an American Starlifter, which had been some 50 minutes behind the DC-10, returned to Christchurch Airport.
We followed essentially the same route. We descended below the clouds for our landing at McMurdo, and we hadn't heard from him in some time, and there was getting to be some suspicion that something might have gone wrong. So we took a look around as we went in. We saw nothing.
The mistaken belief about the plane's final flight path was in time to become enormously significant. But for the moment it meant that the searching aircraft continued to look in the wrong place. As the hours of negative results dragged on, back in Auckland, Air New Zealand's chief executive, Mt Davis, was losing hope.
That the circumstances indicate that any chance that is a very, very slim one.
And then came the end of any hope at all. The scattered, burnt-out wreckage of the Air New Zealand DC-10 had been found on the lower slopes of Mt Erebus, the 13,000-foot active volcano that dominates Antarctica's Ross Island. In Greek mythology, Erebus had been the son of chaos, darkness personified, and the name given to the caverns on the way to hell. It was now to take on a new and equally sinister meaning. And at home, another ancient Greek idea, hubris, the sin of pride, was followed by its fall, as the boastful billboards, "Nobody does it better," vanished. Air New Zealand's Mt Davis ordered that a file be made of relevant documents, and then he ordered that all extraneous matter, like duplicates of those documents, be put aside by destructive process. They went through the company shredder. And the man whose job it was to determine the cause of the crash was Ron Chippendale. With a team of snow and mountain experts, the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents was going south to the scarred slopes of Mt Erebus. One of the questions with which he would have to deal was, when so many people assumed the DC-10 was flying over the low-level sea ice of McMurdo Sound, why had 901 struck Erebus? As they began the grim job of recovering the 257 bodies, they were also looking for two vital pieces of equipment, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. The information sealed in these would answer many questions. Erebus was the second major DC-10 calamity in 6 months. And while the flight data recorder, if intact, would give technical answers, the voice recorder might indicate what human element had contributed to the crash.
The cockpit voice recorder will give us detail of the conversations held on the flight deck in the last 30 minutes of the flight.
And they were intact, both the voice and flight data recorders. Present at the finding of the recorders had been the company's chief pilot, Captain Ian Gemmell. At the inquiry, Captain Gemmell was closely questioned about his Antarctic activities. Until the information in the recorders could be deciphered and returned to Scott Base, New Zealand's Antarctic research station, the crash seemed incomprehensible.
Present with us, and that what may seem to human wisdom like foolishness is God's wisdom. We may not understand with our minds, but we ask for faith provided by His Holy Spirit, that we may accept what has been done.
The flight data recorder indicates that the aircraft was in a controlled flight prior to impact, and that is what we base our opinion on.
So there'd been no technical malfunctions. The DC-10 made a pilot-controlled descent to 3,000 feet, and then on computer track had flown inexplicably straight into the mountain.
13,000 feet ahead.
In Auckland, Ron Chippendale checked the audio-visual briefing played to the pilot 19 days before the fatal flight. It clearly set a minimum safe altitude for the area, 16,000 feet.
Now approaching Erebus at 16,000 feet, the minimum sector altitude. In VNC, a descent to this minimum altitude up to 50 miles before McMurdo will be found advantageous for viewing.
At 1,500 feet, the plane had apparently been flying recklessly low. The chillingly matter-of-fact transcript of the last words spoken on the cockpit voice tape suggested to the accident inspector that there had been increasing alarm on the flight deck just before impact. A ground proximity warning sounded, and the captain called for go-round power, but evasive action came too late. It all led to one inevitable conclusion.
In my opinion, the probable cause of this accident was the decision of the captain to continue the flight at low level toward an area of poor surface and horizon definition when the crew was not certain of their position, and the subsequent inability to detect the rising terrain which intercepted the aircraft's flight path.
The finding of pilot error was in total contradiction of Captain Jim Collins' reputation. Equally, almost any other finding was inconsistent with Air New Zealand's accident-free record. Though Collins had not flown to Antarctica before, he was one of Air New Zealand's most experienced international pilots. And there the matter might have ended. But for this man, Mr. Justice Mahon, he had been called to be a Royal Commission of Enquiry into the Erebus disaster. As the lawyers gathered in Auckland, there were clearly two sides. Air New Zealand and Civil Aviation supported the Chippendale finding of pilot error. Captain Collins' estate and his pilot colleagues did not. The inquiry began on the morning of July the 7th, 1980. It opened with a verdict that had already been reached.
The evidence you're about to give to this Royal Commission of Enquiry concerning the DC-10 disaster at Mt Erebus shall be the truth,
The Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale.
The crew were not monitoring their actual position in relation to the topography adequately.
The Chippendale view was supported by the man responsible for the safety of the Antarctic flights, the Director of Civil Aviation in New Zealand, Captain Kippenberger.
The whole of this latter part of the flight is so alien to good aviation practice that, to me, it is very difficult to know what the pilot was thinking about.
Are you therefore not saying that the sole cause of this accident was pilot error, for which you can find no rational explanation?
No, Your Honour, I'm not really.
His rational explanation was that some mystery illness had afflicted Captain Collins. The first officer, Gregory Casson, either failed to challenge Collins or was too busy to notice.
And insofar as a critic of that view would say, why wasn't Flying Officer Casson similarly affected? You say he was looking at the radio switches.
Yes, although I accept to some degree your suggestion that he may not have been as busy as I've suggested and may have been suffering from the same thing.
An extremely rare phenomenon, would it not?
I would think so, Your Honour.
While he was to reject the mystery illness theory, Judge Mahon still needed to know more about how a DC-10 is flown and navigated. The Air New Zealand flight simulator was one place to find out. Because 901 at the time of impact had been flying in the navigation mode, the computer-controlled automatic pilot, it was necessary to understand the enormously sophisticated computerized navigation system of the DC-10. Mr. Justice Mahon found that the system is amazingly reliable and accurate. A flight plan worked out by a ground computer is fed into the aircraft's computer. At the press of a button, it will then fly the plane stage by stage to any destination in the world. The system is accurate enough to guide the plane from Auckland across the Pacific to an exact runway approach at Los Angeles.
Jefferson distance 299.
In 1977, when the Antarctic flights began, Air New Zealand prepared a flight plan for the DC-10's computers, which took them to an end waypoint above the Williamsfield ice runway at McMurdo Station, an approach theoretically straight over the top of Mt Erebus. After the first two flights, that Williamsfield endpoint was moved slightly to another position at McMurdo Station. The move was very small, and the track still went over the slopes of Erebus. However, Air New Zealand considered the computerized courses were merely a guide to get the pilots into the area. Therefore, in practice, the DC-10s did not fly directly over Erebus. The sightseeing demands of the flights gave the pilots total flexibility.
Our captain is very keen to see a great deal more down here, as indeed all of us are, I'm sure. So our intention is now to go towards the southwest.
What none of the pilots knew, and what Air New Zealand claimed no one knew until after the crash, was that subsequent flights carried a navigation error. In 1978, when the airline fed the Antarctic flight plan into its new ground computer, a mistake was made.
Whilst typing the information from the Alpha worksheet into the VDU, I inadvertently typed the longitude for McMurdo as 164 degrees 48.0 minutes east, rather than 166 degrees 48.0 minutes east.
Chief Navigator Brian Hewitt's typing error was to have, however indirectly, tragic consequences. Initially, the error made the flight plan safer, in that the flights were now programmed to fly down the middle of McMurdo Sound, away from the potentially dangerous high ground of Ross Island and Mt Erebus.
Well, what physically did you do in your check process? Mr. Hewitt?
Just read along the line, and read along the line on the Alpha worksheet.
Did you, in the navigation section, check actual positions on independent material?
I did not.
For 14 months, the flights followed the route safely down the Sound, close to the track used by military aircraft. The pilot's briefing confirmed this Air New Zealand approach. It made good sense, and it was never questioned.
When I left the briefing, I had a clear understanding that we were flying into the McMurdo area up the McMurdo Sound, with Ross Island and Mt Erebus well out to our left. If mention had been made that our track passed over Ross Island and Mt Erebus, I would most certainly have questioned it to clarify my own understanding.
The McMurdo flight plan might never have been questioned, but for this man, Captain Leslie Simpson. Captain Simpson had attended the same briefing as Captain Collins, and he had been given the same flight plan coordinates. As he neared the end waypoint of his flight, 3 weeks before the disaster, he noticed that McMurdo was further away from his computerized navigation track than he had expected.
I thought it would be wise to let other pilots know it was in fact 26 miles across, so that they wouldn't be possibly as surprised or worried about the accuracy of their computers as had been my first reaction when I saw the cross-track display.
He mentioned this to the man in charge of the Antarctic briefing, Captain Ross Johnson, who then asked the airline's navigation section to see if there was something wrong. The night before Captain Collins was to fly to his death, he was at home with his daughters, plotting the route he would follow the next day.
He showed both of us, showed me anyway, that he definitely expected to fly down the coast of Victoria Land. And so as you're flying down the Sound, you'd see on the right the dry valleys, and then on the left Ross Island. And I remember him plotting things with instruments.
That same night, Air New Zealand was changing the flight plan for 901. It was being altered by 27 miles. No one told Captain Collins or his crew. At the briefing 19 days earlier, Jim Collins had been given coordinates to take him down McMurdo Sound. But his plane was now programmed to fly on a collision course with Erebus. And Collins, who had plotted his course the night before, had no reason to believe that the route had been changed. nor to doubt the accuracy of the DC-10 computers.
Sir, I have tried to explain in my brief that as far as anyone knew to my knowledge, the change was not material. If I had seen Captain Collins that morning, I probably would have just said to him, even in passing, well, Jim, there's been a couple of miles change. It won't make any difference to the flight plan. Nobody knew that there was a 27-mile change. This is what my brief is all about.
Keith Ames of the airline's navigation section was saying they were unaware of the original typing error that had taken the track down McMurdo Sound. In ignorance of that error, and believing the route always went over Erebus, they thought they were correcting a minor discrepancy. The change was, in fact, 27 miles.
Had a cross-check been made of what was appearing in the flight plans that the crews were getting, the error would have been readily appreciated, would it not?
Yes, sir.
I suggest to you that's a fundamental check which appears to have been overlooked by whoever checked out that inquiry that Mr. Captain Johnson made of the nav section.
That's an interpretation, sir. The discrepancy being there, it was accepted as the error that had been reported, the hearsay error that had been reported.
Keith Ames argued that Captain Collins should have done what the navigation section had failed to do.
Are you not, in effect, saying, though, that this crew should have checked calculations which had been made by experts in the company's navigation section, rather than a procedural type of check when loading coordinates into the CDU?
Sir, aviation is check, cross-check and recheck. We never take anything for granted.
Why should an air crew check figures which have been produced for them by expert navigators?
Well, sir, it's not so much that they don't trust us. But in aviation, the procedure is to check and cross-check. And this is a cross-check that they can do.
Captain Jim Collins was not alone in expecting 901 to fly down McMurdo Sound that day. Complimentary maps given to the passengers clearly depicted the route over the area of flat sea ice well clear of Erebus. Chief Navigator Brian Hewitt was questioned by the judge.
The navigation section, sir, had nothing whatever to do with the drawing of this chart.
Well, what part did the navigation section
play
then when approached by the publicity department?
We advised the route that we would be following, sir.
And do you say that the publicity people prepared this chart?
Yes, sir.
And from what materials would they do that?
From the information that we had given them, sir. They were probably told, sir, that the route was from McMurdo, from Cape Hallett to McMurdo and back to Cape Hallett. And the drawing of the route, as it is so illustrated, is artist's license.
The route does not end at McMurdo, does it?
No, sir.
Artistic license aside, even the official maps, inadequate as they might appear, involved a strange coincidence. The first flights carried maps that were routed over Erebus. And then, in 1978, there's a change. The flight path line moves to McMurdo Sound. The coincidence is that this map appeared about the same time as that 27-mile typing error mentioned by Brian Hewitt.
You can give us no explanation for that whatsoever.
It is a coincidence. There is certainly, to the best of my knowledge, no intention of the two being used together. The error that was made was an error. There was no intention of the aircraft proceeding down to the west of the Ross Island.
There was yet another coincidence. The Americans at McMurdo controlled all flights in the area. Before each tourist flight, there were radioed copies of the Air New Zealand flight plan, normally a list of coordinates. However, for the Collins flight, an element of vagueness appeared. Instead of McMurdo coordinates, the word McMurdo was substituted, thus failing to reveal that any change had been made. Navigators said this was due to an error in entering the information into the computer. The judge rejected this explanation. Mr. Justice Mahon came to believe the airline had made only one major mistake. They changed the route but forgot to tell Captain Collins. The airline sought to explain this tragic blunder as the result of a series of coincidental errors and omissions.
Agree that was an error or omission?
That was an omission.
When you pulled the flight plan and failed to pick up the difference in the McMurdo position, you agree that was an error or omission?
That was an omission.
It's number 5. Number 6, failure by your section to pick up.
Counsel for Air New Zealand attempted to minimise the impact of this list.
With respect, sir, it may be perhaps inappropriate to list 5 errors when some of them clearly are, such as the original wrong figure and such as the incorrect insertion of 5 in the wrong column, as compared with others which might not truly be termed errors in the same sort of sense.
I was only quoting what he said, that he should have made a double check, was what he said in cross-examination. And I thought he conceded that to be an error. Does that strike you as a remarkable sequence of errors made by perhaps 5 different persons in respect to the same subject matter?
Yes, sir, it's very disquieting.
For all its admitted errors and omissions, Air New Zealand had one ultimate defence. One factor above all others which they believed allowed them to persist in blaming pilot error. Captain Collins had flown too low. And so it seemed that other pilots, like Captain Jeff White, 1 week before the disaster.
The traffic between this area and McMurdo.
Presently, you're the only one flying in Antarctica, 11 kilos.
Okay, we're the only ones in the area. Thank you very much.
The airline and civil aviation permitted a minimum safe altitude on the navigation track to McMurdo of 16,000 feet, 3,000 feet higher than the smoking crater of Erebus.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the aircraft now is just over 10,000 feet, and we're looking straight into Mt Erebus. You can see that great plume of smoke up there from the crater, a very active volcano. One of the interesting things about
Technically, the airline was right. It had told its pilots to stay above 16,000 feet. But the reality of the sightseeing trips, promoted as the experience of a lifetime, meant that few did. Later, in order to be consistent with its stance of pilot error, Air New Zealand had to accuse other Antarctic captains of flying dangerously.
May we take it that your descent from 16,000 to 8,000 took place over the high ground of Ross Island?
You could say that in part, yes.
Yes. And that being the case, was that, in your view, consistent with the terms of your briefings?
In the terms of a strict IFR approach, no.
IFR stands for Instrument Flight Rules, which, to put it simply, apply when the pilot cannot see the ground or sea below him. The airline had set 2 minimum safe altitude levels, 16,000 feet over Erebus and 6,000 feet above McMurdo Station. Not until the Commission had been sitting for 2 months was it revealed by the airline that crews were in fact briefed to go to any altitude authorized by the American Ground Control. and could have descended to 500 feet without breaking any regulations.
I notice you're asking a number of questions about these flight levels. Now, is it the division's position in this matter that it was never aware of flights operating at levels of under 6,000 feet?
Yes, sir. That is our position.
If it was shown that those flight levels were a matter of common knowledge throughout New Zealand, would that still be the division's position, that it was unaware?
It would be, sir. It would be.
Air New Zealand and civil aviation persisted in the claim that they did not know about low flying in Antarctica, despite considerable evidence to the contrary. Apart from general media coverage, an airline in-house magazine quoted the then director of flight operations waxing lyrical about the view from 2,000 feet. The head of Douglas Corporation, the DC-10 manufacturer, had sent to the chief executive, Maury Davis, an article he'd written referring to his flight at 3,000 feet. Air New Zealand reprinted the article in a brochure which went to every household in New Zealand, 1 million copies.
Not been suggested, has it, between the department and the company that the safe thing might be to put the whole blame on Captain Collins?
I can't vouch for all my officers and their discussions, but I have not discussed the accident at all with Air New Zealand since I saw Captain Gemmell when he came off the ice.
I don't suggest you have. I'm only making an inquiry.
No.
But your knowledge, that's not so.
I can assure you it's not so.
The belief that Captain Collins was being made into the scapegoat moved the dead pilot's friend and colleague, Captain Gordon Vetty, to begin his own investigation. Captain Vetty had piloted one of the earlier sightseeing flights to Antarctica, and he couldn't understand why the crew of 901 had flown straight into the side of Erebus. Gordon Vetty began a study of the visual illusions associated with Antarctic flying.
We all believed that there was no problem to separate yourself visually from any terrain using our normal tools of trade, the eyes. What we didn't realise, of course, is that you can have 200 miles of visibility and still fly slap into a mountain.
Passenger photographs taken moments before impact showed that visibility was not a problem. They showed gaps in the cloud through which the DC-10 had descended to get down to the best level for sightseeing. Captain Collins was, in fact, invited down to 1,500 feet by the McMurdo air traffic controller, as revealed in the cockpit voice tapes. The crew obviously believed they were flying safely, well clear of high ground. Captain Collins did not know he was flying into Lewis Bay with Erebus ahead. Instead, he believed he was flying safely down McMurdo Sound along his plotted course. Gordon Vetty developed a theory which said Captain Collins saw what he expected to see, what he had been mentally programmed to see. This artist's impression demonstrates the view down McMurdo Sound. With a low overcast, as there was that day, this is what Captain Collins would have expected to see. In clear weather, Lewis Bay would show Mt Erebus ahead. But with a low sea fog obscuring the cliffs ahead and cloud down to 2,000 feet, it would give the illusion of an horizon away in the far distance. It would have looked exactly like McMurdo Sound. To Captain Collins, who had no reason to doubt his eyes, the deception was complete. The combination of whiteout and expectation was fatal.
Down here, it changes, seems like, in a matter of minutes.
The Americans have had to learn the lessons of whiteout and Antarctic weather, sometimes the hard way. In preparing their pilots for the treacherous conditions, they demand extensive pilot training.
A couple of seasons down here for the junior people, and at least a majority of one season down here for a experienced pilot that's coming in.
On the first anniversary of the crash, Mr. Justice Mann went to Antarctica to check for himself, amongst other things, the Vetty evidence on whiteout. The judge and his party made an approach to Erebus similar to that of 901 exactly a year before. As the helicopter flew towards the point of impact, a series of photographs was taken. Mr. Justice Mann was given the perfect illustration of how the mountain could suddenly disappear on a clear day.
The crew said that that is what Captain Collins would have seen as he approached the mountain side. One of the crew had in fact been there on the day in question. He said these conditions are identical. So what's described as a weather phenomenon is not really so. That weather is quite ordinary in McMurdo, and the result is that you have an ordinary overcast, and if you fly down McMurdo Sound at low altitude, it won't matter. If you fly into Lewis Bay at low altitude, then you are in mortal danger.
The accident report had asked why had Captain Collins not seen Erebus on the DC-10's radar? But the answer was simple. Bendix, the manufacturers of the radar, told Mr. Justice Mahon the equipment would be incapable of detecting the volcano ahead. The DC-10 radar is designed to pick up moisture, which indicates turbulence. But the ice in Antarctica is bone dry. The radar would therefore not provide any warning of danger, and the approved manual says it should not be used for terrain avoidance. But there was still the question of whether the American radar at McMurdo had seen the aircraft as it descended in 2 orbits before impact. This mystery is heightened by the supposed erasure of 5 crucial minutes of tape-recorded radio communication. It was later alleged there were no radio transmissions at this time.
When I went to Antarctica, I was given permission to inspect McMurdo Communications Centre and the control tower in the ice, but only on terms. I wasn't allowed to ask anyone anything. When I went down there, the reception I received from the Americans at Mac Centre was as cool as the outside circumstances or conditions might well have indicated. Very frosty.
After the crash, Maury Davis had ordered the destruction of what might be considered surplus copies of documents relating to the crash. But however this instruction was interpreted, not one original document was placed before the Commission as part of the file Davis ordered to be made. The chief pilot, Captain Ian Gemmell, had gone to the crash site as the airline's senior representative. The Chief Inspector of Air Accidents was not told for 2 weeks that the route had been changed prior to the fatal flight without telling the aircrew. Airline staff knew about the change on the night of the disaster.
New Zealand's technical expert go back to the site?
We do have a Deputy Chief Engineer there still.
As Captain Gemmell and Ron Chippendale were on the ice together, it was important to find out if the chief pilot had known of the error before he left for the crash site.
I had no knowledge of any error.
We had evidence that was known at Auckland on the night of the disaster.
I don't recall, Your Honour, having been told of that evidence or that knowledge.
The judge refused to accept this denial.
You took some envelopes of material back with you to New Zealand from McMurdo, though, didn't you?
I don't recall. Which were they? Can you help me there?
My information is that you were in possession of a blue plastic envelope which you were seen leaving McMurdo with when you departed.
Well, that's news to me. I have no recollection of any blue plastic envelope.
Were you, in fact, on the flight deck of the aircraft during that day at all?
There was no such flight deck in existence.
Well, the nose of the aircraft, what was left of it?
It was very difficult to tell what the nose of the aircraft was. There was many pieces of wreckage. Individually, obviously part of the flight deck.
I don't want to be unfair or misleading to you in any way, Captain Gemmell, but did you go into what was left of the cabin area of the aircraft on Mt Erebus the day following the crash?
It wasn't possible to do that.
Did you, for example, see the instrument panels?
Yes, I did.
They were intact, weren't they?
essentially. And although there hasn't been any evidence about it to date, I'm asking you now, did you see or recover any flight bags at all?
No, I didn't.
Not one?
Not one.
And are you saying that no document or cruise flight bags were recovered?
There was a flight bag in the snow. Belonged to Captain Collins, but it was empty.
Did you see that yourself?
I did. It wasn't, the bag wasn't touched apart to verify that it was empty.
Totally empty?
As I recollect, yes.
What did you do with the bag, Captain?
We left it as it was, in the same position.
On the snow?
That's correct.
So good.
I might add that there were several documents down slope and at some distance from the crash site. When I say documents, they are paper, but the area was heavily crevassed, and the mountaineers gave strict instructions that no attempt should be made to recover them.
Relevant documents belonging to Captain Collins disappeared at Erebus, but First Officer Casson's own handwritten briefing notes were removed from his home the morning after the crash. Mrs. Ann Casson, herself a pilot.
I was not in the house at the time, and they were taken without my knowledge and without my permission. And I did not find out until a couple of days later.
So 2 days later you found out that Captain Crosby had taken away
Yes.
all documents, including private documents,
Yes.
belonging to your husband, which related to flying.
Yes.
The man responsible was Captain Bruce Crosby, whose role was somewhat ambiguous.
Yeah, I was purely acting for the families, not the company.
I understand that, Captain Crosby, but did you hear no word from headquarters, so to speak, that someone in the company was making whatever efforts were available to see if any clue to the tragedy could be seen from the documents which the pilots had left at home?
No, no submission in that order at all.
I asked Captain Crosby to give me back the books, and he would not. And as for the briefing, he said that there were no briefing notes, that it was in a manual, which I found an insult to my intelligence.
And then there was the strange, even sinister burglary of the Collins house. Those responsible were clearly interested in the flight and the inquiry. Documents were taken. Valuables were left behind.
So that drawer was in fact open for the passports to be removed, but the other valuables in that drawer did not go away with them.
That's right. That's correct.
What were those valuables?
There weren't that many of them. There was a pearl necklace and there was a large ruby ring surrounded by diamonds. Those were what I would call the valuables.
Yes. And they'd be fairly distinctive, I take it.
They would be quite distinctive, yes.
Like the careful man he was, Captain Collins kept 2 diaries for writing down flight information. His personal diary was recovered, but there was clearly something suspicious about the other one.
Captain Collins' personal diary, in which he would record flight details, appears to have not been found.
That would be the appear to be the situation, yes.
And his second book of record, his ring binder, was recovered with all the pages missing.
That would appear to be the case. It's all removed because they were damaged.
Would you pass that to the witness, would you, Mr. Exhibit 251.
Thank you.
Now, that ring binder with this leather or plastic covers is not damaged at all, is it?
Correct.
Well, then how do you suppose the pad of papers secured by the ring binders could have disappeared?
I would have no idea, sir. As I say, unless they were removed because they were damaged, that would be the only reason.
If papers were removed from the ring binder, who would have done that?
I would have myself, I presume.
Well, do you recall doing that?
No, not specifically.
Ten months after it began, the inquiry concluded. The report that followed came like a bombshell.
Television New Zealand News with Philip Sherry.
Good evening. The report of the Royal Commission of Enquiry into the DC-10 disaster in Antarctica has finally been released. Mr. Justice Mahon says neither Captain James Collins nor First Officer Gregory Casson made any error which contributed to the crash. He concludes that the single dominant and effective cause was the mistake by airline officials who programmed the aircraft to fly directly at Mt Erebus and omitted to tell the air crew. And in a section highly critical of the airline management, he talks of a predetermined plan of deception at the inquiry. It was, he said, an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders. I am forced reluctantly to say, Mr. Justice Mahon says, that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. He also refers to the disappearance of documents taken by an airline employee from the home of the first officer. They were destroyed as irrelevant. A most remarkable decision, the judge says.
The report was released late this afternoon by the Prime Minister.
The Attorney General has handed the report and associated material to the Commissioner of Police to see if any prosecution should be made as a result of the findings.
Air New Zealand's Chief Executive, Mr. Murray Davis, has just announced that he will not be quitting his job. He says he's still got the confidence of the airline's board and its management.
Murray Davis and the Board of Air New Zealand began legal moves to contest the judge's report. Several days later, the airline suspended 12 of its employees, whose roles had been questioned by Mr. Justice Mahon. The reason given was that they could not carry out normal duties under the threat of police prosecution. They included Captain Bruce Crosby, Navigator Keith Ames, Chief Navigator Brian Hewitt, and Chief Pilot Captain Ian Gemmell. Several days later, Murray Davis retired. In 40 years, he had risen from office boy to become Chief Executive.
I've become the focus point of this. I hope that as a consequence of what I'm about to do, they will be satisfied and leave the company alone. They've got a sacrifice. Let them be content.
Perhaps for those with relatives and friends on Flight 901, justice was seen to be done. Captain Collins and his crew had been vindicated. There was now an overwhelming need for the airline to put its house in order, to ensure that mistakes which contributed to the Erebus disaster could never happen again. Yet it appeared that the airline had not learned the lessons of Erebus. 13 months after the 901 crash, Air New Zealand narrowly avoided another potential tragedy caused by error involving the computer. Air New Zealand called it the 4th of December incident. An incorrect sample flight plan was issued for a flight from New Zealand to Rarotonga. If someone had not picked up that certain figures were wrong, insufficient fuel could have been loaded with potentially tragic consequences. Air New Zealand was unable to discover how it happened, but it was exactly the sort of computer-based mistake the airline had earlier assured the inquiry could never be repeated. In the Erebus tragedy, computer-based error was just one of the factors. Equally important was the fact that Air New Zealand had not prepared its pilots for flying in Antarctica. The judge concluded overall that the crash was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, caused by a series of disastrous administrative blunders. But the ultimate key to the tragedy lay here, he said, in the white silence of Lewis Bay. The place to which the airliner had been unerringly guided by its microelectronic navigation system, only to be destroyed in clear air and without warning by a malevolent trick of the polar light.